Imagine a world where 60% of everyone you've ever met, your family, your neighbors, your friends, vanishes in less than 2 years. No explanation, no visible enemy, just a silent, creeping shadow that moves from house to house. In the annals of true crime, we often look for a person behind the darkness. But what if the perpetrator was nature itself, and the victim was an entire continent? This is the story of the 14th century, the ultimate cold case of human survival. Statistics can be numbing, but let the weight of this one sink in. Between 1347 and 1351, the global population didn't just stall, it plummeted by an estimated 100 to 200 million people. If you were born in the decade leading up to this, you weren't just unlucky. You were born into a death trap. There was no police force to call, no forensic lab to analyze the evidence. There was only the sound of wheels on cobblestones and the recurring cry to bring out your dead. How did a civilization at its peak crumble so fast? How did a mystery that began in the far reaches of the East travel thousands of miles to dismantle the known world? Tonight we investigate the ultimate time of death. We look at the evidence left behind in mass graves and the psychological scars that changed the human DNA forever. If you were born then, could you have survived? Or was your fate sealed the moment you took your first breath? To understand the tragedy, we must look at the victim, the 14th century world. It was a time of immense faith and growing trade. Cities were booming, and the Silk Road was the internet of its day, connecting distant lands. But this connectivity was a double-edged sword. The world was more vulnerable than it had ever been, unaware that the very roots bringing them silk and spices were also carrying a silent executioner. In true crime, we identify the suspect. Here the suspect has a name that still chills the blood: the Black Death. For centuries, its true nature remained a mystery, a super predator that baffled the greatest minds of the era. It didn't discriminate between the king in his castle or the peasant in his hut. It was the perfect, invisible killer, and its arrival would mark the darkest chapter in human history. The mystery begins in 1347. Ships arrive in the port of Messina, Sicily. The sailors at the oars are barely alive or already gone. Those who witnessed the arrival described it as if a curse had been unleashed. The crime scene was expanding by the hour. Why did the authorities fail to quarantine the threat? Because they were looking for a human culprit, sins, alignment of the stars, or poisoned wells, while the real killer was much smaller. Imagine trying to solve a crime without knowing how the weapon works. 14th century doctors were the first investigators, but they were working in the dark. They used herbs, bloodletting, and prayers. They noticed the patterns, the swelling, the fever, but they couldn't see the bacteria. This lack of information created a panic that was just as lethal as the disease itself. The witness statements from the time are harrowing and often contradictory. Some claimed the air was poisoned, others blamed a cosmic misalignment. Chroniclers like Boccaccio recorded that people would eat lunch with their friends and dinner with their ancestors in the afterlife. The inconsistency of who lived and who died made the killer's logic seem terrifyingly random. Why couldn't they stop it? In a modern investigation, we close borders and track movements. In 1348, the killer moved at the speed of a galloping horse. By the time a city realized the threat was at their gates, it was already inside the walls. The sheer scale of the crime overwhelmed every social system, from the church to the crown. The greatest challenge wasn't just the loss of life, but the loss of hope. When the worst time to be born reached its fever pitch, the the social contract snapped. Parents abandoned children. Priests refused last rites. The mystery of why this was happening led to a breakdown in human empathy, a psychological scar that investigators today still analyze to understand societal collapse. Centuries later, forensic science finally gave the killer a face, Yersinia pestis. But the investigation didn't stop there. Modern researchers have exhumed mass graves, plague pits, to extract DNA from the teeth of victims. What they found was a pathogen so perfectly evolved for destruction that it remains one of the most studied subjects in biological history. For years, the theory was simple: rats and fleas. But recent cold case re-evaluations suggest it moved too fast for rats alone. The investigation now looks at human parasites and even airborne transmission. The killer was more versatile than we ever imagined, adapting to its environment to ensure maximum impact. In 1348, London was a rising metropolis. Within months, it became a morgue. We look at the records of Smithfield, where thousands were buried in a desperate rush. The crime scene here shows no signs of hierarchy. Rich and poor were tossed into the earth together, a grim equalizer that proves the killer had no bias. Anonymous accounts from the time tell of the Great Dying. One man, Agnolo di Tura, wrote that he buried his 5 children with his own hands. These aren't just historical footnotes. They are the victim impact statements of an entire generation. Their voices reach out across 7 centuries, warning us of the fragility of our existence. Why did the medical detectives of the day fail so spectacularly? They were looking at the wrong evidence. They believed miasma, foul air, was the culprit. They wore the iconic bird-like masks filled with perfume to filter the evil. In reality, they were walking into a trap, unaware that the very clothes they wore were harboring the fleas that would end them. Following the timeline, we see the killer move north, from Italy to France, then England, and eventually Scandinavia. It followed the trade routes like a meticulous planner. Every stop on the map was a new crime scene, and every city had the same story. Initial denial, followed by total catastrophe. One of the most disturbing leads in this investigation takes us to the siege of Kaffa. Rumors persist that the Mongol army used biological warfare, catapulting diseased remains over the city walls. If true, this marks one of the first recorded instances of a killer being used as a weapon, turning a natural disaster into a calculated act of war. Not everyone died. This is the breakthrough in the investigation. Why did some survive while their entire families perished? Scientists are now looking for the Delta 32 mutation, a genetic shield. The worst time to be born actually forced a brutal form of natural selection, rewriting the human blueprint in real time. As the winter of 1349 arrived, the world went silent. In many places, the killer had run out of victims. This was the psychological peak of the tragedy, a world where the survivors looked around and saw nothing but ghosts. The structures of society, law, order, and religion faced their ultimate trial. The most shocking discovery wasn't how people died, but how they changed. With the workforce decimated, the survivors realized they had power. For the first time in history, the victim stood up. The end of the Black Death didn't just bring peace, it brought the end of the feudal system. The killer had inadvertently birthed a new world. Just when it seemed the killer had vanished, it returned. This is the serial killer aspect of the plague. It didn't just strike once, it came back in waves for centuries. Each time, the fear returned. People born in this era lived in a constant state of parole, never knowing when the shadow would return to claim the rest of them. Imagine being a child born in 1340. By the time you are 8, the world ends. By the time you are 20, you have seen more death than a modern soldier. The worst time to be born wasn't just about the disease. It was about the lifelong trauma of being a survivor in a world of graves. We have analyzed the DNA, the maps, and the journals. The verdict is clear. The 14th century was a perfect storm of climate change, famine, and a highly evolved pathogen. It remains the deadliest cold case in history, a reminder that the greatest threats to humanity aren't always human. The aftermath was a landscape of broken families. Entire lineages were wiped out in a single week. We see this in the unclaimed estates and the sudden shifts in land ownership. The trauma was so deep that it took centuries for the population of Europe to return to its pre-1347 levels. The crime changed art forever. This is when we see the rise of the danse macabre, the dance of death. It became a public obsession. The realization that death was the great equalizer moved from a scary thought to a daily reality reflected in every painting and poem of the era. The legal fallout was massive. Labor laws had to be rewritten because there were no workers. The killer had essentially forced a massive redistribution of wealth. While the tragedy was immense, the consequences paved the way for the Renaissance. Out of the ashes of the worst time, a new light began to flicker. Could it happen again? That is the question that keeps modern investigators awake. The killer isn't extinct. Yersinia pestis still exists in the world today. We have the forensics to stop it now. But the 14th century remains a haunting warning about what happens when the world is caught unprepared. We have journeyed through the darkest years of human history. We've seen the killer emerge from the shadows, decimate a continent, and disappear back into the darkness, leaving a transformed world in its wake. The 14th century wasn't just a time of death. It was the ultimate test of the human spirit. The story of the worst time to be born is a story of us. It is the story of how we endure, how we investigate the darkness, and how we find a way to move forward even when the odds are stacked against us. The scars of 1348 are still visible if you know where to look, in our laws, our art, and our very blood. As we close this investigation, we have to ask, if you were born in 1340, would you have been a survivor or a statistic? History is a puzzle we are still solving. What do you think was the most shocking part of this cold case? Could society today survive a killer of this scale? Let us know your theories in the comments below. Be respectful of the history and suggest which era or true crime mystery we should investigate next. Thanks for watching.